Chapter 22, Reaching Out Cross-Cultural Interactions. Section 1, Long-Distance Trade and Travel. Patterns of long-distance trade. Some of the motives for long-distance trade was the diplomacy and the missionary activity. There was the Silk Roads, which was luxury goods, sea lanes of Indian Ocean Basin, which was the bulkier commodities like steel, stone, and building material. The Trans-Saharan caravan routes, which drew out West Africa into the larger economy of the Eastern Hemisphere. During this time, there was a lot of development in the trading cities, and there was also a lot of nomadic invasions, which would cause local devastation, but they would expand the trading network. A very important long-distance traveler during this time was Marco Polo. He lived 1253 through 1324. He traveled to China with his merchant father and uncle. He entered the service of Mongol Kublai Khan. He left for Venice after 17 years in China, and his experiences were recorded by a fellow prisoner in the Venice-Genoa conflict. He was a great influence on the European engagement with the Far East. And another very important long-distance traveler was Ibn Battuta. He lived 1304 through 1369. He was an Islamic diplomat and legal scholar. He worked in governments during extensive travels, and the reason for his travels beyond the Hajj were he was welcomed as an Islamic judge, a qadi, in many Muslim kingdoms. New maritime technology made long-distance travel more common. He was able to take advantage of the existing trading routes, and the Mongol kingdom provided safe passage for the merchants and the travelers. Here's a map showing Marco Polo's travels and Ibn Battuta's travels. So you can see there's a lot they passed. Political and diplomatic travel. After 1000 CE, trade required diplomatic relations. And in the 13th century, the Mongols and the Christians recognized the Muslims as a common enemy, and Pope Innocent IV invited the Mongols to convert to Christianity, but the Mongols basically denied their offer and threatened Christianity in general, I guess. And the Mongols sent someone to form an alliance after that, and then the alliance was broken when Mongol Ilkhan converted to Islam. There was a lot of missionary travelers. There was the Sufi missionaries, and they traveled throughout new Muslim territories throughout 1000 through 1500 CE. There was the Christian missionaries, which accompanied the Crusaders. There was the Roman Catholic priests who traveled east to serve European communities. And there was John of Monte Corvino. He traveled to China in 1291. He translated the biblical texts into Turkish, and he built churches. He built some churches. And then there was a cultural exchange. Songs and stories were exchanged. European scientists consulted with Muslim and Jewish counterparts on the understanding of the natural world and agricultural and technological diffusion. There was agricultural and technological diffusion, and the magnetic compass from China allowed mariners to sail over long stretches. There's also the spread of crops like citrus fruits, Asian rice, cotton, sugarcane, and the Muslims introduced crystallized sugar to the Europeans, and the demand on it increased rapidly. The Europeans used Muslim precedent of having large populations of slaves to work on the sugarcane plantations, and there was some gunpowder technologies coming out at the time. The Mongols and the Muslims spread gunpowder from China, and the technology reached Europe by 1258. The first military use was mainly for bombs launched by catapults into cities under siege. Section 2, Crisis and Recovery. Interactions between humans and the environment. During 1000 to 1300 CE, there was a medieval warming period, and it enabled the Vikings to settle in Greenland and other places. There was a little ice age in 1300 and 1800 CE. It led to the decline of agricultural output and widespread famine and the drying of the Middle East. Then there was the bubonic plague, or otherwise known as the Black Death, and here's a table to show how many died, I guess. No, not died. How the population went down. Anyways, the Mongols and the merchants and the travelers spread the disease west, and the disease was carried by fleas and rodents. In 1331, it reached southwest China. 1346, the Black Sea ports. 1347, Mediterranean ports. 1348, Western Europe, and Sub-Saharan Africa and India was not really affected, but it was there. Anyways, the population declined in millions, as shown in the picture. And there was social and economic effects. There was the decline in trade, decline in population, massive labor shortage. Governments attempted to freeze wages and stop serf movements, but it resulted in riots. Then there was recovery in China because the Ming Dynasty. And so basically the Yuan Dynasty collapsed in 1368 and the Mongols departed and they left in a state of political turmoil. And after that, well, way before this, there was an orphan who was raised up by monks and he made his way up through military ranks. And then then he became emperor because he proclaimed a new Chinese dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, which stands for brilliant dynasty, in 1368, and it lasted through 1644. There was the Ming centralization, which was the reestablishment of Confucian educational and civil service systems. The centralized authority was more tight than ever before in China, and the execution of a minister suspected of treason began traditions of direct rule by the emperor. There was a heavy reliance on eunuchs and mandarins, and there was a centralized structure, and their centralized structure lasted through the Qing Dynasty all the way to 1911. There was their economic recovery, and basically they conscripted labor to repair and rebuild irrigation systems. They promoted manufacturing of porcelain, silk, and cotton, and there was a cultural revival. There was also an attempt to eradicate Mongol legacy by promoting traditional Chinese culture, and the Emperor Yongle commissioned 23 the emperor commissioned 23,000 to history, philosophy, and literature. Then the recovery in Western Europe was basically it was a little bumpy at first because they still had problems with the plague and it complicated their political affairs. The Holy Roman Empire survived, but only in name because the effective authority lay with the German princes and Italian city-states. And the King of France and England sparred over land for 100 years, which was the 100-Year War, up until 1453. And then the Mongols extracted tribute from Russia for almost 250 years. The key to state building. Italian first, they directed taxes and long-term bonds. France directly taxed sales and property. England directly taxed property and plow teams. Then there was the establishment of large standing armies with gunpowder power, and French Louis XI who lived 1461 through 1483, had an army of 15,000 troops, and the nobles couldn't keep up. Meanwhile, in Spain, Fernando Aragon married Isabel of Castile in 1469. It was a major political and economic alliance, and it completed the Reconquista, which expanded beyond the Iberian Peninsula to Italy, and it funded Columbus's quest for the western route to China. Then it's the Renaissance. This is a picture from the 100-Year War. A depiction of the 100-Year War. This is what I have for the Renaissance. Basically, the Renaissance was the rebirth of artistic and intellectual creativity that reflected the continuing development of a sophisticated urban society. The inspiration from classical/realistic Greek and Roman artists rather than medieval predecessors. The artists studied the human form and respected emotions of their subjects. There was a linear perspective made art realistic and naturalistic. There was lots of architecture during this period of time. There was lots of dome buildings, and it's centered in Italy in the 1400s. There's a lot of people who were involved in the Renaissance. There was Leonardo da Vinci, Donatello, Brunelleschi. They kind of came from Donatello's Divine Comedy around 1300-ish to the death of Michelangelo in 1564. And Shakespeare was still technically part of the Northern Renaissance. There was the humanists. The humanists looked to classical rather than medieval, and they were highly devoted to Christianity. And artists in Europe and other parts of the world showed lots of interest in the Byzantine and Asian worlds. Section 3, Exploration and Colonization. This is a map showing Senghe's voyages, Diaz's voyage, Da Gama's voyage, and Columbus's voyage. Section 3 basically revolves around Chinese and European voyages of exploration through 1405 and 1498. And yep, that's all.